That style of video has been one of my most popular formats. I guess it has to do with, one, you wanna see what I mean by making it look real. Two, you just wanna see if I can do it. And three, it's in quotes, like it's a challenge from someone else. Well, today I wanna break down the process of how I make my toys look real. Hey yo, this is Matt. I really like this Deadpool figure, and he does kind of look real already on his own. But just because he's a good looking figure doesn't mean you can set him up however and he's gonna look real. If I just put him like this, it's obvious it's a toy because a real person wouldn't stand like that. So stage one is going to be the pose. And although you might think a standing pose is easier than an action pose, I think a standing pose is a bit more tricky to be real. An action pose can kind of create a distraction and make it busy enough to look real. But if it is just a standing pose, it's going to be more obvious to see the imperfection. So if you are going for this realistic shot, set up your posing first. Before you get your stage and setup ready, I would recommend just sitting and messing around with your figure and getting it into a good pose. Like I mentioned from before, get a pose from a movie or a show or the internet or someone else's toy picture. You can copy poses, just don't copy the shot. So once it's ready, then it's time for stage two, the setup. Like most things with photography, lighting is gonna be, if not the most important, one of the most important factors. If I do have this epic pose or even a simple one, but it's lit like this, it's not gonna look real. You can see that he looks like plastic. So good lighting is essential. Soft light will be the best most of the time. And remember, you get soft light by diffusing it somehow, by covering it with something white or an actual diffuser, or you can try bouncing it. One recent lighting setup that I've been using a lot is going to be you're placing the light behind the subject and then it's lighting up behind and you're creating this rim light, and then in front you have a bounce card or white paper or a reflector, and that's bouncing the light onto the front of the subject. And so it's not just your own light, you could also use the sun, which is how I used it in this Deadpool shot. So I have the sun pointed at Deadpool's back, but then he's not gonna be lit up, kind of silhouette, but I didn't want that. And so I had this giant poster board. I used that to bounce the sun from behind Deadpool, and now that extra soft sunlight is bouncing onto Deadpool, lighting him up, giving him some color. And so that's it for lighting. Just make sure the lighting is good. And now we can move on to the next part of the setup, which is setting the scene. You need to make sure whatever scale you're shooting in, that the stuff that comes out looks like it could be in that scale. If you shoot figures in grass, if it's just normal green grass, it might be easy to tell like, hey, that's just green grass that you put the figure in. If you can position it in a way to where it looks like it's tall weeds, like it could be kind of jungly, that will help sell the realness of it. And then if you are using a diorama or you're using props, make sure they're to scale. So scaling is huge. Like, know your scale. But then some of these little weeds or branches, they could look like actual plants or something. So there's ways you can work around that. So when it comes to the framing of your shot, it's important what's not in the frame as much as it is what is in the frame. And so that's why I liked blasting the dirt. That's why I have this blackboard, because I know when I'm editing, it'll be easy to cover that up and hide the stuff that I don't want to come out. So with the dirt, I didn't want it to be blasted onto him. I didn't want like a war scene, epic battle scene going on. I wanted it to kind of add some motion, and so that's why I blasted it behind Deadpool, and kind of, it did give some motion and it did cover some more of that background. And just remember, this is all for making figures look real. I'm not saying this is like a toy photography rule or anything like that, even though it can be. This is just for like how I set up these real shots, which isn't something I do all the time. Sometimes I just want to make good looking shots. So now that your lighting is good and the scene is well put together, you take the shot and we move on to stage 3, the edit. I use Photoshop for all my editing, but most of this should work in similar editing programs. I'm not going to go into depth here, but starting off the edit, you want to fix any lighting or color issues. Usually keep it clean. You probably don't need anything too fancy. If you are using effects, those can be tricky because your effects will be judged if they look real or not. So be careful with applying and using effects if you're going for that real look. And this is one thing I don't do for most of my toy photos, but for this next part, we're going to remove some of those obvious joints. For my other shots, I like that they still have what makes them toys. Sometimes they are obvious and sometimes they're not. But if we are going for that real look, they have to go. At least most of them do. So there's a few ways I use to do this. Most of them involve the lasso tool. All I'm going to do is circle around the joint and then do content aware fill. And this usually does the job really well. If not, I also like using the patch tool to match different parts. And the last tool I use is the healing brush tool, or clone stamp. For this, you option and then click the spot that you want to copy, and then where you brush, it's going to cover that with what you selected. And so for most figures with armor, this is pretty easy to do. Even some of these pieces, like on the shoulder and the chest, I didn't want to remove those because to me, if you're looking at it, it doesn't look too bad. It just looks like armor or pads. So using the same tools, another thing I sometimes will do is make the knees and elbows thicker to blend better. When you bend the figure, sometimes it looks like a little sliver. No one has a sliver for an elbow. That's pretty much it for the edit on this one. And it's definitely a similar process to other real looking shots that I've done. And so after following these stages, you should have a photo of something that doesn't look like a toy. Hopefully it looks real. If you do decide to try this, tag me in your pics, or if you have questions or comments, or you're stuck, or you can't figure something out, or you have other requests, let me know down below. To create and inspire.